Can I begin by saying it's a great honour to be invited back to the Afghanistan Human Rights and Democracy Organisation to speak. It's a humbling experience also to speak about peace when we are in the same building as the remarkable museum which we've just seen memorialised in the footage in front of us. It serves as a reminder that for people in a country such as Afghanistan, peace is not simply an abstract or remote idea, but it is something which is directly relevant to the life opportunities that people may be able to pursue. And therefore, an interest in promoting peace is a very understandable kind of focus for organisations and for individuals, and it's a privilege for me to be able to share some thoughts in this particular series of presentations. What I'd like to do this afternoon is begin by talking about the complexity of the idea of peace. Second, I want to talk about peace processes and some of the pitfalls that are associated with peace processes. And to illustrate those points, I'll draw in part on the recent engagement between the United States and the Taliban that unravelled on the 7th of September. I'll then go on to make some comments about challenges that lie beyond simply the negotiation room where negotiators may be encountering each other, that relate to things like implementation and the substance and nature of agreements. And then I'll offer a couple of concluding reflections, and I hope that will provide plenty on which we can then chew for discussion purposes. Let me begin by making a comment about the definition of peace. The classic definition that has been widely used but is now increasingly challenged sees peace as simply the absence of war. But for that to be useful, one needs to probe a little deeper than that kind of statement might lead one to think. And there is a very nice illumination of the difficulty to be found in the book Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes that was first published in 1651. And he put forward a metaphor about peace and war, which I think is still very useful to help us understand the challenges of definition. He said, "For as the nature of foul weather lieth not in a shower or two of rain, but in an inclination thereto of many days together, so the nature of war consisteth not in actual fighting, but in the known disposition thereto. During all the time there is no assurance to the contrary." And that is a very useful insight, because it means that we shouldn't mistake a lull in fighting for peace, that for peace to be even minimally achieved, it is necessary to build into place certain protections that ensure that there won't be a rapid recurrence of violence or hostilities, giving the lie to the claim that peace was actually achieved. And that is no recent insight, but it's one that does bear repeating, because sometimes people do write as if all we needed to do was stop the guns, and it's more complex than that. We actually need to approach the building of peace with some sense of how one stops the guns being used again in the future for the same kind of political objectives for which they might have been used in the past. Now, another approach which surfaced much later in the 1960s was one which was taken by a Norwegian peace researcher, Johan Galtung, who argued that the absence of war could be seen as what he called negative peace, the absence of actual violence, but equally important in his argument was what he called positive peace, or the absence of structural violence, by which, when you unpacked his writings, he meant things like inequality, injustice, inappropriate treatment of groups within a population. The difficulty with his particular approach was that almost anything he didn't like ended up being defined as structural violence, even though it might involve, for example, patterns of accepted behaviour within cultural communities that they were not interested in changing. He sought statistically to define structural violence has any life expectancy shorter than that of the Nordic countries, which at the time had the highest life expectancies in the world. But it didn't really distinguish between improvements in life expectancy that arose through voluntary change in patterns of behaviour by people, or improvements in life expectancy that might be produced by disruption of traditional societies or coercive activities of a state to impose particular patterns of behaviour. So it had some influence, but I don't think it carried us that far beyond what Hobbes had to say. Another useful insight, although not from peace studies, came from the political theorist Isaiah Berlin, who made the point that in the real world we actually have a range of different values, all of which may be important. Peace is very important. So is liberty. So is justice. So are a range of other normative concepts that at different times people have seen as centrally valuable to the life of a community. The kind of features of a community that make life worthwhile, that make life worth living. And this, of course, is something which haunts peace processes. It's been very much at the fore in commentaries on the recent negotiations between the United States and the Taliban, where there were mounting concerns that, for example, the gains made by women in Afghanistan in the last 20 years might be casually sacrificed in the name of peace, that considerations of equality or justice or liberty might be subordinated to the idea of peace in a way that would leave significant elements within a population suffering seriously because of the new arrangements put in place. And I'll come back to that because there is a way of carrying this discussion further. I think the implication of all of this is that one needs to be very careful when embarking on peace processes, that one does not end up producing a situation that is worse than would otherwise have been the case, either because inadvertently the way a peace process is structured creates incentives for further violence in the future, or because values that are really important for particular components of a population are sacrificed in the name of peace. Either can be seen as a way in which a peace process is performing unsatisfactorily. And I've always been reminded of a comment from the 1950s in the Soviet Union. It was recorded by a Soviet dissident many years later, that a man went to his rabbi in the Soviet Union and said, "Rabbi, is there going to be a war?" And the rabbi said, "No, there will not be a war. There will be such a struggle for peace that not a stone will be left standing." And there's a warning there, I think. A first question that is always important to ask is whether it is the right time to pursue a peace process. Why might a peace process be pursued? Now, there's one body of serious work that says a peace process can be effectively pursued when a conflict has ripened for settlement, in much the same way as one can eat fruit when they've ripened on the vine. And ripening in this sense has classically been defined in terms of a hurting stalemate, a situation in which none of the hostile parties feels that it is in a position to achieve its core objectives, and each fears that there's going to be a further deterioration in its own situation. That's the classic model of a hurting stalemate. And I'd mention here that my colleague Fahunda Akbari, who's with us today, has been writing in detail about this for her doctoral research, and I owe much of what I have to say here to the insights that she's generated in her research. Now, it's simply not the case that all conflicts are ripe for a settlement. You can actually have a brutal and savage conflict which is not ripe for settlement because one or more of the parties feel that they are achieving what they have set out to achieve, or that if they continue to engage in fighting without a ceasefire, they will be in a better position at some point in the future to get what they want than they are now. So a question always to ask is whether a conflict is actually ripe for a settlement, and if it's not, pressure to embark on a settlement process is likely to be at the expense of the party that is already feeling uncomfortable, either because its armed forces are under attack or because its population is under attack or whatever. And that can lead to a very perverse situation in which the aggressors are treated as if they are the innocent victims of conflict, and the victims of conflict are treated as if they're the obstructive aggressors standing in the way of a peacefully negotiated outcome. So this is always a question to ask at the beginning of discussion of a peace process. There's then the question of who should be included in a peace process. And again, a common response is that one should exclude actors that will simply be spoilers, but one needs to include the actors that are essential players in the process, that will be potential spoilers if they are not given a seat at the table. Now, this can create several problems. One is that you may have to sit down with some very unappealing and unappetizing, really nasty actors on occasions if you're going to negotiate at all. So that's one problem. But if you cast the net too widely, you can end up empowering marginal, unpleasant actors that have simply been looking for the status that comes from being given a seat at the table. On the other hand, if you exclude actors that are really essential to the process, what's likely then to happen is that some essential issues will be neglected as well, and you won't have anything that's sustainable at the end of the negotiation, that you will leave something critical off the schedule of negotiation, and that there'll be a high price to pay. Now, let me make a comment here on the process that saw the United States engaging with the Taliban. To me, with a sense of history, it begged belief that the United States would agree to sit down with the Taliban in the absence of the government of Afghanistan. Whether one likes the Afghan government or doesn't like the Afghan government, it nonetheless occupies Afghanistan's seat in the General Assembly of the United Nations. It is widely recognised as a diplomatic actor. It's been put in place by elections of sorts, certainly by a more pluralistic process than saw the leadership of the Taliban constituted. And interestingly, it had a veto capacity that was not, I think, fully appreciated by the United States. And this became apparent, hasn't really been discussed that much, but in a recent news story, which was that at the very end of the negotiations between the Taliban and the US, and Zalmay Khalilzad, an issue that came up was a demand by the Taliban for the release of Taliban prisoners in Afghan prisons. And I was told the Afghan government was given a list of 5,000 names and asked to respond to the Americans within 24 hours to the list, which is a non-serious process, of course. Now, the moment the American mediator or negotiator agreed to this being discussed at all, he created a veto capacity for the Afghan government. Because whilst the United States could unilaterally withdraw its forces from Afghanistan, one thing it could not do was unilaterally bring about the release from Afghan prisons of Taliban prisoners. And it actually didn't reach the point where the Afghan government could have played a very tough hand on that particular issue, because President Trump pulled the rug away from the process as a whole. But to me, this was a mark of the amateurish approach of the United States and its team to these negotiations. What they actually should have said when the prisoner issue came up was, this is an issue on which you have to talk to the government of Afghanistan. We cannot talk about that, you will have to talk to the Afghan government. But there's no evidence that they actually said that. And that suggests to me a real dearth of experience and skill on the part of the American negotiators. there's also the case when you choose a party to a negotiation of exactly how much you know about that party. There was the famous episode some years ago when President Karzai and various other international actors negotiated with someone they thought was Akhtar Mansour from the Taliban, who turned out to be a grocer from Quetta. And to me that was interesting, partly because it was probably the highest point that a grocer had ever reached in international negotiation, but also it showed how little international actors actually know about decision making at the higher levels of the Taliban. We really don't know nearly as much as we would need to know in order to be able to negotiate safely with the Taliban. We do not have a good understanding of their power structures. And to give you an example, a Western writer based in Ireland, Michael Semple, who's published extensively on the Taliban and spent years writing about the Taliban, published a paper with the United States Institute of Peace in December 2014, which said Mullah Omar is the unchallenged leader of the Taliban and the source of authority on all issues. The only problem was he'd been dead for 18 months at that time. And there's a lesson there. We know a lot less about the internal dynamics of top-level decision-making in the Taliban than we would like, and yet that's exactly what you need to understand if you're going to be able to negotiate safely with such an actor. Fahunda, in her research, has also done some remarkable work looking at the concept of an actor in diplomacy more generally, looking at autonomy from outside control and influence, representativeness of wider constituencies, and organisational cohesion as essential features of a diplomatic actor. And one can raise big questions about the Taliban under all those headings as well, but I'll leave that to her to elaborate more generally if she's so inclined. Now, another issue which came up in the recent negotiations, and I was frankly astonished by this, and I've been talking about it in public for months and months, was that a great deal of the commentary on the negotiations seemed to be premised on the view that Dr. Khalilzad was the ultimate decision maker. Whereas it was always clear that President Trump was going to be the final decision maker. And President Trump is the most unpredictable president that the United States has had in my lifetime. And unpredictable is a kind way of putting it, really. You could be a lot nastier if you wanted to be about his mental processes and things like that. So there was no basis upon which anyone should have been surprised when on the 7th of September he decided to pull out of the process. It was ultimately his call. It turned out that Dr. Khalilzad had met President Trump as mediator or negotiator for the first time only on the 16th of August this year. He was not somebody who was part of President Trump's immediate circle at all. And that again should have prompted a certain amount of scepticism about the degree to which commitments that he could make in a negotiation process would ultimately bind the United States, because only the president was going to be in a position to decide what ultimately the US would agree to consider binding. So the question of who makes the ultimate decisions is always important in a peace process. It's very tempting to think the person across the table has authority, full authority to negotiate, but that's never the case in these kind of circumstances. And it frankly has not been the case in diplomacy since the early days of the 20th century. The moment the telegraph came in the late 19th century, it eliminated the idea of the so-called plenipotentiary representative who could bind the home government simply with a signature. That's not the case and has not been for a very long period of time. Now, another question which comes up is to do with the packaging and sequencing of issues for discussion in a negotiation. The Geneva Accords on Afghanistan of April 1988 did not bring peace to Afghanistan. And one of the reasons was that they did not deal with one of the crucial issues which was animating the Afghan parties at the time, the regime of Dr. Najibullah and the Mujahideen parties, because they were concerned with internal political order in Afghanistan. Who would exercise political power within Afghanistan? And that was exactly what the Geneva Accords on Afghanistan failed to cover. They were silent on the matter of internal political order in Afghanistan, and thus they simply remitted the Afghanistan conflict to the battlefield, as we all, the older ones amongst us, witnessed at the time. And that can be a severe defect in a process if it actually leaves unaddressed a crucial issue which genuinely matters significantly to some of the parties. Now, in the recent case, one of the peculiarities that it struck me like a train, I would have to say, was that Dr. Khalilzad began the process by saying nothing is agreed until everything is agreed. Now, this is a relatively common negotiating strategy in international negotiations, because if a party early in the process gets agreement on some of what it wants, that can provide it with an incentive to make concessions in a later stage of the process in order to hang on to what it thinks it's already likely to be getting. But what was arresting about the recent process was that Dr. Khalilzad abandoned that halfway through in favour of a position saying, well, the United States has reached its agreements with the Taliban on withdrawal of American forces and the prevention of Afghanistan being used as a haven for international terrorism, and the rest will, the ceasefire and the matter of dialogue with the Afghan government will be left for the future. And this entirely changed the dynamic of the negotiation in favour of the Taliban. Because there's an old saying, it goes back to 1597 when Francis Bacon wrote an essay called Of Negotiating, in which he said, it is better to deal with people in appetite than people who are where they want to be. And the Taliban, by the time the negotiations collapsed, had got the precious privilege of a seat at the table with the United States, and they had conceded nothing. They'd actually conceded nothing along the way. There's an old expression, a gift that keeps on giving, and the Americans seem to be the gift that kept on giving under the circumstances. And in that sense, it violated every basic precept of diplomatic engagement, that one would go to the length of changing the framework of the negotiation simply in order to pacify one of the parties. That's not a good way in which to proceed. There's another question which also, I think, is illuminated by the recent experience, and here I want to quote a very insightful passage from Michael Walzer's book, Just and Unjust Wars, that was recently put up on Facebook by my friend Ahmad Shuja. And Walzer said the following: there is always a humanitarian impulse to stop the fighting, and attempts are often made to impose a ceasefire. But it isn't always true that such ceasefires serve the purpose of humanity. Unless they create a better state of peace, they may simply fix the conditions under which the fighting will be resumed at a later time and with new intensity, or they may confirm a loss of values the avoidance of which was worth a war. And that's a very important kind of warning. And it brings me back to the point that I foreshadowed earlier. In certain circumstances, a peace process can incentivise violence. It can provide incentives for a party to increase the violence of its behaviour in order to improve its position at a final stage of negotiation. And one of the things that's striking about recent events is actually the period since September 18, when the Americans initiated the process, was not marked by a decline in the violent activities of the Taliban, but an escalation. People have quoted a UN figure that more Afghans were killed in the first 6 months of the year by government aligned forces than anti-government elements. But the point I'd make is that a lot of people were still killed by anti-government elements, and far more people were wounded by anti-government elements. So it's not as if there was actually a lull in fighting as a result of this process. If anything, you can argue that the process incentivised higher levels of violence in order to improve the perceived positions of the different actors at what might seem at the crunch stage of negotiations. And then there's one final point about pitfalls of processes that I want to make, and it's the following. Exactly with whom do you need to be speaking? When I was young and travelling in Europe in winter, you used to see musicians in public streets in places like Paris, and they would have a barrel organ, and they'd turn the handle on the side of this box and music would come out. And this was a very traditional form of street entertainment in Europe in the 19th and 20th century. And the classic organ grinder would have a monkey, a tamed monkey, that would go around with a silver cup into which people could put coins to thank the organ grinder for the music. Now, there's a saying that people used to say, why talk to the monkey when you can talk to the organ grinder? And it applies to negotiations as well, and it comes back to the point Farhunda's made in her writings about autonomy. Is there any virtue in an agreement with the Taliban if Pakistan, as host of the Taliban, has not reformed its ways? Because we know, going back to 1998, that the Interior Minister of Pakistan, General Nasirullah Baba, who used to refer to the Taliban as our boys, was heavily involved in supplying weaponry through ISI to the Taliban at the time. And unless there is a very credible set of arrangements in place to stop the Pakistan ISI from arming and sending another group into Afghanistan under a new name, Harakat al-Azadi or something like that, there's every reason to feel that a negotiation simply with the Taliban might fall far short of bringing peace to Afghanistan if Pakistan's overall calculation is that an unstable Afghanistan is preferable to a stable Afghanistan that might have good relations with India. So again, the geopolitics of the situation have been missing from a great deal of the commentary. But unless and until something is done that addresses the issue of Pakistani meddling in Afghanistan, problems are likely to continue, whether the source of the problems is seen to be the Taliban or some other force. Okay, let me make some concluding comments about additional problems and about some issues of justice. Peace agreements are often signed but come unstuck at the point of implementation. The genocide in Rwanda, which killed 800,000 people in 2 months in 1994, from April to June, took place after a peace agreement had been signed by all the relevant parties, the Arusha Accords, with active negotiation by the Organisation of African Unity. And it was in large part because there were still some armed groups that were hostile to the idea of peace, and they had enough capacity to wreck the process, which they actually did by shooting down a plane containing the president of Rwanda and the president of Burundi, and this became the trigger for a highly organised slaying of moderate members of the Hutu ethnic group, members of the Tutsi ethnic group, and some other minorities as well. One of the most horrible examples of a peace process unravelling that we've ever seen, but a warning about the dangers that can accompany peace processes that are not sufficiently alert to malevolence on the part of actors or spoiler behaviour. And here I think there are real questions about that go back to the impenetrability of the Taliban leadership. When it comes to implementation, if you have a conflict that is purely a conflict of interest, if some actor looks as if it's going to be troublesome, you buy them off. You find new resources and distribute them to the troublemaker in order to keep the troublemaker happy. That is unlikely to work when you have a conflict that is not just a conflict of interest, but a conflict of values. And one of the problems in again, negotiation with the Taliban is that the Taliban are not just an interest-grounded movement, they're also a movement grounded in their own curious set of values. And when that's the case, it can be much, much more difficult to rescue a process if it unravels at the implementation phase than if you're purely dealing with the conflict of interest. Again, I think this is something that the Americans tend not to get. And Laurel Miller, who was from the Office of the Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan, wrote an article in the press in 2017 saying the conflict in Afghanistan is a conflict of interest, and I was screaming at the paper and saying it's more complex than that. Don't bring your simplistic ideas to the Afghan theatre of operations because they'll cause trouble. Now, there's also an issue which is often overlooked of what the very spectacle of negotiations taking place can do to the wider environment within a country. There was a hint of this in a really interesting New York Times article earlier this year, I think by Mujib Mashal, which quoted an Afghan soldier in the Afghan National Army saying, "We're being told to go and fight the Taliban, and the Taliban are leading some of our politicians in prayers in Moscow. And some of our political leaders are talking to them. What goes on here?" And there's a wider point here. It's very hard to say to the army, go and die in the battlefield, if at the same time you're saying, we're about to sign a peace agreement with this group, or peace is just around the corner. Why would you want to put your life on the line under those circumstances? And if that's the case, that can then feed into the dynamic of the internal process of running the Defence Ministry, running the Afghan National Police, all these kind of things. In other words, negotiation is not something which has no effects. The spectacle of negotiations taking place can actually have wider effects of all sorts of different kinds. And the most important here are probably reputational. Thomas Hobbes, again in his book Leviathan, had a great line. He said, reputation of power is power. And my strong sense in a country like Afghanistan is if people think the government is going to come out on top, it will come out on top. But if people think the Taliban are going to come out on top, they will come out on top. Not because people love the Taliban, but because it does not pay to be on the losing side in conflict in Afghanistan. And if you look at things like the collapse of Najibullah's regime in 1992 or the collapse of the Taliban in 2001, it didn't come about because one military force ground its way to the centre of Kabul with tanks. It came about because people, seeing how the wind was blowing, repositioned themselves. And one of the greatest weaknesses of the American approach to recent negotiation, this goes right back to their approach to South Vietnam in 1973, is that they seem not to understand that there is a psychological dimension to negotiations as well. And one of the worst attributes of the recent process in this respect was the exclusion of the Afghan government. Because the exclusion of the Afghan government from the negotiations was as good as saying the Afghan government is a force we can afford to ignore. It's only one faction amongst many different factions. We can get away with treating it as marginal. And the only historical examples that come to mind are the exclusion of the Czechoslovak delegates from the Munich conference in 1938 and then the exclusion of the South Vietnamese government from the Paris negotiations in 1973. And neither of those cases had a happy ending. They both ended up a terrible mess, in fact. The worst outcome, therefore, is if the spectacle of negotiation taking place can actually trigger a cascade. And my great fear before the 7th of September was that there would be some kind of agreement struck, signed by the Taliban and the Americans, and that suddenly the situation on the ground in Afghanistan would begin to unravel. That the Americans would suddenly discover that it's far from withdrawing their forces in an orderly fashion, they were having a messy evacuation that could culminate with a helicopter leaving the roof of the American embassy and with everybody else left to fend for themselves. And that, of course, would be a recipe not for peace in Afghanistan, but for a revived civil war. So that's, I think, one of the dangers when you can get a cascade taking place. Now, just two other quick points about what happens outside the chamber. There's a very useful distinction that's been drawn by the philosopher Avishai Margalit between a compromise and a rotten compromise. He wrote a little book called On Compromise and Rotten Compromises. And he defined a rotten compromise as one that establishes or maintains an inhuman political order based on systematic cruelty and humiliation as its permanent features. And this, I think, was certainly something which was a risk arising from negotiations with the Taliban. Afghan friends of mine who were in the group that went to Doha, who talked to the Taliban and who I think were much shrewder in their understanding of what was going on than some of the internationals floating around, came back and said to me that they didn't have a sense that the Taliban had changed in any fundamental way from what they had been in the 1990s. And of course, when you are far from state power, you can say anything you like as a way of trying to get power. You know, we've become feminists, we've reformed our attitude to minorities. We're not like we were in the 1990s. That's no indicator whatsoever of how a group will behave if it gets power again. And here, the famous observation in the 19th century by Lord Acton comes to mind. He said, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And it's a very sage warning in this kind of situation. Now, sometimes you may want to talk to unappetising actors. The Swedish diplomat Count Folke Bernadotte in the dying days of the Second World War negotiated with one of the most dreadful German actors of the time, Heinrich Himmler, the head of the SS, who was more than anyone else responsible for the killing of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. But he was on his way out, his regime was collapsing. It proved possible to save the lives of about 300 Scandinavian Jews through that negotiation who probably would have been gassed otherwise. So on the whole, you could say it wasn't something which entrenched a situation of injustice or humiliation or evil or anything like that. A very different situation, however, from a negotiation with the Taliban. And here I think it's worth noting that whilst various international actors have been saying things like, oh well, the Taliban never agreed to a ceasefire, so what if they let off a bomb in Kabul? That's effectively what a former UN envoy was saying yesterday on Twitter. The response to that is, when you let off a bomb in Shashtarak or a place like that, and the victims are civilian, this is a war crime. It's not normal military activity directed against military targets. It is, on any reading of the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and a range of other instruments, a grave breach of international humanitarian law, which would expose somebody to prosecution for crimes in the conduct of war. So that, I think, is required to contextualise some of the excuses that have been offered for the failure of the Taliban to agree to a ceasefire. The great danger, I think, of negotiations is when their actual purpose is not their stated purpose. I think we all know the actual purpose of the negotiations between the Americans and the Taliban was to allow the Americans to cut and run and have their forces withdrawn from Afghanistan before an election year came along with President Trump up for re-election. Now, that is in no sense an objective which is in any way related to the well-being of the people of Afghanistan. And I would have to say, whatever what else one thinks of him, I think President Rouhani showed extraordinary patience in the face of the provocation that these discussions involved, and I don't think I would have been nearly as patient as he proved to be. Just let me offer a couple of concluding observations. When you have a value conflict, it's a mistake to think you can have a distributive solution to it. This was what worried me about the idea of there being an intra-Afghan dialogue to culminate in power sharing with the Taliban. The Taliban have never been power sharers. I'm old enough to remember the narrative before the Taliban took over Kabul in 1996 in Western circles, and you got it all the time at conferences. The Taliban are a group of innocent students. They are not interested in politics. They are only interested in purifying the country in the face of evil warlords. they will retreat from politics and probably invite the former king of Afghanistan to return. They will bring peace to the country. American corporations will find a way of building oil and gas pipelines from Central Asia to South Asia, and the income from that process will generate wealth which will reconstruct Afghanistan. And Zalmay Khalilzad wrote an article in the Washington Post in September 1996 called Afghanistan Time to Re-engage, which regurgitated a lot of that argument, saying things like, the Taliban in power will have to focus on things like economic and social development. Well, it didn't work out quite like that, at all. And instead we saw things like the massacre in Mazar-e-Sharif in August 1998, 2,000 people killed in a matter of days, which became the trigger for the huge outflow of refugees by boat into Southeast Asia, making up the Afghan population in Australia from which we now benefit, but terribly disruptive to the lives of ordinary Afghans in Afghanistan. So the notion that the Taliban would willingly share power, I think, is wishful thinking of the dreamiest possible variety. This, I think, is a very powerful reminder of a further point, which is that justice can actually be a victim of peace processes. The demand for justice has long taken second stage, the back seat in Afghanistan. It's not just the Taliban, there are a lot of other Afghan political actors, to be blunt about it, whose behaviour in the past would not stand up to close scrutiny if you look at their actions from the point of view of international humanitarian law. And the museum downstairs contains, in a very personal and immediate sense, emblematic representation of how people in Afghanistan for more than 40 years have suffered from the actions of a whole range of political actors down that time, yet very few have ever been brought to any process of accountability or justice which would stand any kind of scrutiny. And some would say, well, this is the price you pay for peace. But Afghanistan has not exactly experienced peace as a result of overlooking these sorts of issues either. I'm not saying it's an easy issue, but it's certainly important to bear in mind that justice may be the first thing that's thrown out the door when people begin to moot the idea that peace is just round the corner. And the final point I'd make is the following, that when you have negotiations, it is simply never the case that every relevant interest is in the room for negotiation. Never. At the end of the process with the Taliban, no women from the Taliban, very few women on the other side of the negotiation process either. That's a worry. It's a worry when we're talking about historical minorities that have been suppressed in the history of Afghanistan too. It is classically the case that peace processes are dominated by dominant groups within a society. And the danger is that the terms of a peace agreement, rather than producing a normative framework that will allow a society to move forward, may actually end up entrenching norms of partiality that work to the advantage to some degree of some groups in society, but massively to the disadvantage of the vulnerable or the powerless. And that's something I think which it's always important to bear in mind when looking at processes of this sort. I've gone on for too long, but I hope there are some points there that are of interest. So thank you very much for your patience.